Born in Sanahin, Armenia in 1895, Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan was the most prominent Soviet state figure of Armenian origin. A survivor, Mikoyan managed to weather every Soviet leader from Lenin to Brezhnev. He was once the number 2 man in Moscow after Nikita Khrushchev, and his legacy is complex. Today on Groong, we will explore this extraordinary historical figure. To help us unpack the historical legacy of Mikoyan, Pietro joins us today from Cleveland. Pietro is a historian and a Ph.D. candidate in Russian history at the Ohio State University. His dissertation focuses on Mikoyan's reforms in de-Stalinization and the nationality sphere in the Khrushchev-era USSR. His analyses on Russia, Armenia, and the post-Soviet space have appeared in The Nation, The Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Russian International Affairs Council, Russia Direct, and Hetq. He has also worked with the Gomidas Institute in London on the republication of 19th century accounts of the Russian Caucasus and Armenia. Hello and welcome to this conversation on Groong, Pietro.
Thank you very much, Osbed, for having me. It's a pleasure being with you today.
It's definitely very nice to talk to you in person. We're usually storming over texts.
Well, it's a pleasure, again, being here with you. Yeah.
All right. Well, so who was Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan? How did he rise to power? Tell us a little bit about his journey from his birthplace of Sanahin in northern Armenia to the corridors of power in the Kremlin.
So, Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan was originally from Sanahin, Armenia, as you were saying, from Lori province in northern Armenia. He, from here, went to the seminary. He started off in going to the Narcissian school in Tiflis in Georgia, and then he was at the Gevorgian seminary in 𝐂𝐲𝐬𝐻. And then from there, over time, he became actually more of a convinced revolutionary, and he participated in the Baku Commune. His great hero was Stepan Shamyan. After this period, he was in Nizhny Novgorod, and from there he was the governor of the North Caucasus region. And after this, he became essentially the Soviet Minister of Trade. So for much of the 1930s, this is a very famous thing that many people from the post-Soviet space know, that he was involved, for instance, in bringing Eskimo pies, the best cuts of meat, or the beefsteaks, were known as Mikoyans. He was also involved in securing supply during World War II for the Soviet side, for the Red Army. And then after Stalin dies, he really ascends to the top and becomes really the number 2 man in the Kremlin after Nikita Khrushchev. And this is a very important moment. He co-leads de-Stalinization, and some people would even argue that he actually was the father of the de-Stalinization ideas. But it was between him and Khrushchev, and the seeds for it were also kind of in the air, and also great international diplomat. So we know about his role in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we know about his involvement in the Hungarian episode, his involvement in China. So that's kind of how he rises, to give you the summary version, from this young Armenian kid in Sanahin to being top Kremlin high official in Moscow.
One of the interesting things that I've noted about him is that few Soviet leaders were able to transcend the major political shifts that occurred during the USSR throughout its history. He managed to survive from Ilyich Lenin to Ilyich Brezhnev. How did he manage to weather the storm of Stalinism and move beyond that?
I think that the question is very important because Stalin actually promoted Mikoyan, and Mikoyan also had a very interesting relationship with Stalin. Mikoyan felt that there was a chance that he could harness his power in a positive direction. So he was loyal to Stalin, for instance, in the 1930s. But he also hoped that he could moderate his behavior and guide him toward better policies that were more moderate. But that was not to be, and actually Stalin grew to distrust Mikoyan, and by the 1950s, even though we say that Mikoyan, survived, he could have been executed by the British during the Baku Commune period, during the Russian Civil War. He escaped death many times. The one time that he came closest to death was the late Stalin period, when Stalin is really at the apogee of his power, and Mikoyan is really on the list to be killed in a new round of purges. So he did survive Stalinism, but just barely. And also, too, there were other elements as well. For instance, his sons were arrested by the Soviet state during the war for treason because they were playing a game of government, just kind of fooling around, and they were taken away. Then you also had the situation where Sergei Mikoyan's wife, Alla Kuznetsova, she was the daughter of Alexei Kuznetsov, who was the head of the Leningrad Party leadership, and they came to a head with Stalin in the Leningrad affair. at the end of the 1940s. There was also his opposition in 1944 because that this would maybe damage the reputation of the USSR. He opposed the deportation of the Chechens and the Ingush. So, and part of that was also because he had a personal relationship with these people. He did create the Chechen Republic. He was trying to stay in Stalin's good graces. He was trying to guide his behavior, but in the end, he fell afoul of Stalin. And that is, I think, one of the times he really came closest to being purged and liquidated.
Now, the Chechen Republic, was that to appease Stalin?
In terms of the creation of Chechnya?
Right.
Actually, no, because he was sent to the North Caucasus. This is a very interesting chapter. So Mikoyan, being an Armenian from Sanahin, understood very well the Caucasus as a multi-ethnic region. And he was very sensitive to the different ethnicities. There were times when he became more of like an internationalist Bolshevik, where he became less sensitive, let's say, to the nationality issue. But then, really, in that era, when he becomes the governor of the North Caucasus, he really becomes very, very sensitive to the different ethnic concerns of the nationalities in the region, right? So one of the big problems that they had in governing the North Caucasus is how do you deal with the Chechens? How do you get them to accept Soviet rule? And one of the ways Mikoyan suggested was give them autonomy, make them into an autonomous republic, give them their own boundaries. The idea was to pacify them in a way of not necessarily relying on force, but relying on kind of more carrots than sticks, I would say. And so that's kind of the idea, to allow them to use Chechen language. Mikoyan recalled that mullahs would resent if you told them that the people have to learn Russian. But if you told them that the people have to learn Chechen, the mullahs had nothing to say.
Yeah.
So these nationalization policies helped legitimize Soviet rule in the region, and actually for Mikoyan it was a huge success in terms of what the objectives of the Soviet nationality policy wanted. Relative to that, it was a success. So that was his involvement in Chechnya. When he was the governor of North Caucasus, he effectively created that, and he was sensitive in general to the different ethnic concerns of all the peoples in the region.
I want to quickly go back to the Stalinist era. There's a lot of controversy surrounding Mikoyan, especially regarding his role in the Stalin terror. So along with Georgy Malenkov and Mikhail Litvin, he was tasked by Stalin to purge the Soviet Armenian leadership in 1937. What was Mikoyan's exact role in this episode?
This is a very important episode. I've done extensive research on this involving the Russian archives and the Armenian archives in Yerevan. So I was working in the social political archive on Bagramian Avenue in Yerevan, and also I was working in the Russian State Archive of Social Political History and with the Russian State Archive. I gained access to documents that I would not have been able to access in Moscow because the archives that they came from are not open to researchers. So the Russian Presidential Archive, I have materials from there, and the Central Archive of the FSB. And those materials came to me through a researcher at Memorial. They were Xeroxed in 1992. Those documents in many ways were key because they give me and anybody else who wants to know about this period the most complete understanding that we could have. So to kind of summarize what exactly happened, really the Purges in Armenia don't begin in 1937 when Mikoyan is there with Malenkov. They actually go back to the period of 1936. And in 1936, this is when you have, to give you the context of what's happening in the Caucasus, Lavrenti Beria, who's the first secretary of Georgia, is rising to power, and he is kind of consolidating himself in Georgia, and he really is not necessarily in favor of this idea of United Transcaucasian Republic, which dissolves in 1936, but also he likes to exercise kind of informal influence throughout the region. And one of the things he did was he put forward this kind of history of the Bolshevik Party in the Caucasus. And this history was a very questionable one because it just focused on Stalin's role and Beria's role in the Caucasus, in the Bolshevik Party movement in the Caucasus. To the Armenian Party, this was highly controversial, and the Armenians were like, well, no, you can't do that because our people contributed to the Bolshevik Revolution. And the person who was the first secretary of Armenia at the time was Agassi Khanjian. And so Armenia was kind of like a hotbed of opposition to Beria. And this came to a head when Beria met Khanjian, and he shot Khanjian in his office. Now, how do we know that he did that? Because the 1956 Soviet investigation proves that this was not a suicide, as Beria was saying that Khanjian killed himself. No. The way in which they did this kind of thorough investigation, they found out indeed he was shot by somebody else. So
this is amazing.
He was shot by Beria personally, Khanjian. And Beria then proceeded to put in these men who were real nasty characters in the Armenian history. We talk about people involved in the Purges. He put in 𝐒𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻 as the first secretary of Armenia, and as the head of the NKVD in Armenia, you had 𝐋𝐢𝐞𝐿. And 𝐿 was really kind of like a sadist. People in Armenia, remember this to this day. One of the things that actually is kind of interesting is, you might not know this, the former president of Armenia, Serge Sargsyan, his grandfather was taken away during the 𝐿 period. And the people in the village...
I did not know that.
Yeah, and the people in the village remember that they had to cheer as this was happening. This was a very terrible period for most people in Armenia, and what happened, though, is that 𝐿 and 𝐻 went too far, because they decided to arrest the prominent Armenian Bolshevik Sahak Ter-Gabrielian, and they put him under excruciating interrogation. Ter-Gabrielian either was pushed out or fell from the fourth floor window of the Armenian NKVD headquarters on Nalbandian Street in Yerevan. They try to keep it a secret from Stalin. Now, when Stalin finds out that they tried to do this, he's very angry. He says, I'm going to take care of this situation, and I'm going to send Georgy Melenkov and Litvin to Yerevan to take care of the Armenian leadership. Now, to give you a context who Melenkov was in this period, Melenkov, as Khrushchev would say in his memoirs, was Stalin's errand boy. And in this period, that takes on a very dark context, because Melenkov was going around throughout the USSR and basically executing the leaderships in Tatarstan, in Belarus, and all these different places. He left a trail of blood behind him throughout the Soviet Union. So having him was a natural choice to go to Yerevan and purge the Armenian leadership. He and Litvin arrived in Yerevan to convene a plenum of the Armenian Communist Party. And they spoke at this plenum, and this was on September 15th, 1937. Stalin had written a letter on September 8th that they then read out to the plenum. They basically were ordered to arrest 𝐿 on the spot. They didn't have enough evidence for 𝐻 at the time, so they had to find evidence. And so they do manage to find some evidence. Then, suddenly, Stalin decides to invite Mikoyan to participate in this as well. So Mikoyan doesn't arrive with Melenkov and Litvin. Everybody thinks that they all came at once, but the reality is the documents show from the FSB archives that Mikoyan came later. We're talking like 5 days. September 20th, 5 days later, he arrives in Yerevan to join Melenkov and Litvin. In the quest to find evidence against 𝐻, there is actually a whole transcript in the Armenian social political archives where Melenkov is meeting with Armenian party leaders, and they're complaining of Trotskyite and Dazhnak sabotage in northern Armenia. So now Melenkov is taking this seriously, and he tells Stalin, and Stalin says, update Mikoyan about this. So when Mikoyan arrives, Melenkov gets him up to speed on what's going on. So 2 days after Mikoyan arrives, September 22nd, the plenum is reconvened. The Armenian Review in the early 1950s published an account by an anonymous person that actually lines up with the archival evidence, where this eyewitness says that he was there at the second plenum, and Mikoyan read out the note. We know from the archives is he read out the note on the 22nd. We also know that what he read was on the fly, because we have handwritten notes, not a formal speech. And Mikoyan was used to doing this because he did this in the Baku party leadership during the Civil War. He had to give speeches on the fly. So in 1937, he goes out on September 22nd, the evening, and reads out this speech. And basically, 𝐻 is in the crowd and the eyewitness. 𝐻 is in attendance. When Mikoyan read out these allegations, he stood up and said, you lie. And then apparently he reached in his coat pocket for something, and it looked like he was reaching for a gun, and then he was surrounded by guards. And then Mikoyan said, hand it over, and the guy revealed that he had a gun, and total bedlam ensued. 𝐻, needless to say, after that was the end of him. Beria was there. Beria came because those were his deputies, 𝐻 and 𝐿. Now, Mikoyan thought at the time, and in his memoirs, he was worried about Beria's presence. He thought maybe Stalin is using him as extra enforcement. But the reality is that he was worried about his protégés. So those people were purged, and Beria had to watch and accept it, but then he was involved in helping them appoint a new first secretary of Armenia. Now, in the meantime, Mikoyan then, according to his memoirs, he had to sign off on a list of 300 people to be purged. He wasn't comfortable with this, and he tried to cross out one name, Danush Shaverdian, who was a very, very famous Armenian Bolshevik and an old comrade of Mikoyan's. So this situation takes on a personal turn. He tries to cross out the name, but it does no good. Apparently, even 300 was not enough. There was a request.
Pietro, quick question. Who draws up these lists?
These lists are drawn up by local NKVD. So even if 𝐿 is purged, there still is an NKVD apparatus that's still at work purging enemies of the people. So there are different kind of categories, right, of anti-Soviet elements. Category 1, you're immediately arrested and executed. Then category 2, it's like arrest and exile. given the additional demand from the local Armenian Party leadership that there was sabotage and that we need to do something. Mikoyan and Melenkov and Litvin consulted with each other, and they proposed raising the Armenian quota for Category 1 elements, and these are the people who are immediately arrested and executed, was originally set at 500. And they proposed, in a note signed by Mikoyan and Melenkov and Litvin, to increase repressions by an additional 700 people. And then you also had Yezhov sign off on this, and it suggests an additional 1,500 people. And this is what, Stalin signed off za. So this is the kind of period we're dealing with. Now, it's important to know, though, that Mikoyan was not for purges. He was against this. He made his opinion plain to Stalin, but he was really kind of forced into the situation. That's the most important point.
I've read one of your interviews. It's just amazing how this whole thing reads like a mafia environment. People putting these lists out for hits and high-level people getting together and one shooting the other. It's just an amazing environment that you're describing.
Oh yeah, and actually it's quite remarkable that Mikoyan, survives in this. And also Mikoyan is interesting because this is the only time he is sent out by Stalin anywhere. Stalin, I believe, did this for two reasons. Well, number one reason, which is the reason that most historians say, is because Stalin wanted to test the loyalty of Mikoyan. Because his opinion of the purges was not so high, as I've already said, so Stalin wanted to test his loyalty. But the other thing I also think is that because Mikoyan was the most prominent Armenian in the Soviet leadership, it would send a message to the Armenian party leaders to get in line. So that was, I think, the motivation for Stalin to send Mikoyan to Yerevan in September 1937. And then also the issue then comes to who takes the place of Almatuni, and then they appoint Grigory Arutinov. So they put him there. He's an Armenian who just speaks Russian, and he's from Tel Aviv, Georgia. And so Arutinov then became the first Secretary of Armenia for most of the Soviet period after this episode. So this is a very actually important episode in many ways, but more significantly, after all this, Mikoyan becomes a Supreme Soviet deputy for Armenia, for Yerevan, from this period of 1937 all the way to 1974, which is really kind of interesting. But in the period of late Stalinism, that is to say the Arutinov years, from 1937 to 1953, he uses his position to kind of shield Armenia from additional purges as best as he can. But I want to get to that point about the position of the Supreme Soviet Deputy because it's very important.
I want to ask you actually, as we get past the Stalin era, what role did Mikoyan play in the process of de-Stalinization?
Okay.
First in the USSR generally, and then also Soviet Armenia specifically.
Okay, so Asbed, I will put it like this to you. We were just talking about the Supreme Soviet Deputy position and that I would address it later in this interview. Well, now this question allows me to jump right to that point.
Okay.
Right? So we're in the context of that Stalin dies in March 1953. There's a power struggle that ensues, and Beria has his eyes on the prize very clearly, and Khrushchev has his eyes on the prize as well too, in terms of the Soviet leadership being the prize. And Beria himself attempts to do some kind of proto-de-Stalinization efforts. But some of these things, like for instance, an amnesty of prisoners, he doesn't distinguish between who is a political prisoner and who is like a general convict. He was the head of the secret police from 1939.
Yeah, from the history of it, he's almost a criminal himself. He
was a criminal. He was a criminal. There's no other way to look at it. I would say from 1938 all the way to 1945, he was basically the head of internal affairs in the USSR. So Beria was purged. He was arrested in June 1953, and then he was executed in December 1953. After his execution, Mikoyan began receiving letters from all these family members of victims of repression, mostly from Caucasian old Bolsheviks, from Mikoyan's old Bakuvian circle, which is to say people of Armenian descent. I would say probably over 50%, just over 50% were of Armenian descent, but also are Georgians, Russians, Jews, different nationalities.
And what about from
were appealing to Mikoyan. Azerbaijan too. That's another thing I want to discuss as well. In 1964, he goes to Baku and he has a meeting with rehabilitated old Bolsheviks, including Azerbaijani victims of the terrors. But he was receiving all these letters beginning at the end of 1953. Then he goes to Yerevan. And this is a big element of my research. It's a very important point. He goes to Yerevan as a Supreme Soviet deputy on March 11th, 1954, just a few months after Beria's death. He goes to Yerevan and he delivers this remarkable speech where he calls for a more liberal line toward the nationality policy And he is essentially saying that we should oppose national chauvinism, but we must also equally oppose national nihilism. And for instance, we should be more sensitive to Armenian national concerns, that the works of Rafi and Patkanyan should be republished. Also, the memory of Myasny Khan, the great Armenian Bolshevik, who was the leader of Armenia in the 1920s, at the beginning of the 20s, his memory should be preserved.
Yeah.
But most importantly, in the speech, he dropped a bombshell, calling for the rehabilitation of the writer 𝐂𝐲𝐻𝐻. And at that moment in the audio, it's an incredible moment because I got the audio of the speech from the Armenian National Archives. And at that moment, for maybe a little over 30 seconds, there is loud applause. Loud applause.
I can't imagine how it must have been in that room.
You can feel at that moment that everything changed. You can feel it in the applause. There is a hope that there's a better future here. As soon as he says the name 𝐂𝐻𝐻. And it's an incredible, incredible moment. Regina Gavzarian, who was a good friend of 𝐂𝐻𝐻, she was instructed to bury his unpublished manuscripts after he was arrested. In her memoirs, she remembers the day when Mikoyan said this, and she remembers, I'll never forget that as soon as he mentioned the name 𝐂𝐻𝐻, like, she was delirious with joy. And at that moment, she went and exhumed the manuscripts from the ground. 2 years before Khrushchev denounced Stalin, he is in Yerevan. 2 years before Khrushchev even does his speech. This is so important in terms of the timeline. He goes to Yerevan and he delivers a speech calling for rehabilitation of 𝐂𝐻𝐻. It heralded the thaw in Armenia. And you can't view the Karabakh movement, the 1965 demonstrations, without the 54 speech. Now that's only the beginning of the story. So Arutinov is purged in 1953, and there's a new Soviet Armenian First Secretary, Suran Tovmasyan. And so Tovmasyan decides to form this commission, Rosmotrenia, on reconsideration cases, so to speak. And also on the committee, in addition to Tovmasyan, you also have Yakov Zorobian, you have Anton Kochinyan, all these major Soviet Armenian state leaders on the committee.
These cases were called reconsiderations?
Reconsiderations because about half of them were basically essentially rehabilitation cases. Armenians who had been, exiled to the Altai, people who had been wrongly expelled from the party, these kind of cases that were clearly related, people who had been arrested in 1937. So it was very clear what the intent of a good chunk of these cases were. But also you had people who were complaining about housing, who were demanding better conditions in Yerevan, living conditions or environmental conditions, these sorts of things. And so you had a kind of a mix of letters that this commission had to consider. But the fact that they were looking at letters dealing with concerns related to rehabilitation is very significant. In addition to this, Mikoyan began a whole process, really, of looking through all these letters, because the speech, in many ways, in 1954, was a signal. It was more than just something, a signal to the Armenians about a more liberal policy, although that was part of it too. It was a signal to people all throughout the USSR that I am open to looking at your cases, and that the Soviet government is open to looking at your cases. And in April, the number of letters Mikoyan receives mushrooms. Then we also have the documents of Mikoyan looking at each individual case. In the 𝐋𝐢𝐻𝐳 Archive, which is the Russian State Archive, you have whole lists where the names of all these people are there and the individual cases, what the story is behind their arrest, let's say. And he signs off personally in blue pencil after each one as they get resolved. And he forwards some cases to Roman Rudenko, who is the prosecutor of the USSR, or some of these letters would be sent to Anton Kochinyan, who is the head of the Council of Ministers of Soviet Armenia. So he was literally, deeply, thoroughly immersed in this process of de-Stalinization.
So, Pietro, was Mikoyan a Soviet, an Armenian, or a Soviet Armenian leader?
I would say definitely he was Soviet Armenian, in the sense that he was not just a Soviet politician of Armenian descent, but he was very much in touch with his Armenian roots. As I said, that after the 1937 episode, Mikoyan, originally he used the supreme Soviet position to kind of shield Armenia from additional purges, like in 1937. But after Stalin's death, he uses that position to showcase, I would argue, Armenia as a model of the Soviet nationality policy. To this point, he invests heavily in this republic in terms of helping with infrastructure projects, helping with major economic development in the regions, let's say, in small villages, helping build hospitals, helping build schools, all throughout Armenia. The evidence I have for this is not only in terms of memoirs, although we have that. So if you look at memoirs of Soviet Armenian state officials, so for instance, like Anton Kochinyan, he devotes a whole chapter to Mikoyan, and that's in the Armenian language. But in addition, if you go to the Russian State Archive in Moscow, there, if you look at his 1954 trip to Yerevan, there's a whole listing of all the orders he gave to Soviet Armenian leaders on that trip, what to do. For instance, he would say, like, the road to Sevan from Yerevan needs to be lined with trees. So everybody knows that road from Yerevan to Sevan in Armenia, and it has trees. And that's a legacy exactly of Mikoyan.
Was he a micromanager?
I think, you know what, I think he might have I think he might have been a little bit, because, and actually that's why I almost say that he was just as influential on the development of the Soviet Armenian Republic as any Armenian first secretary. He was at that level. The Soviet system was a highly centralized political system, centralized economy, especially thanks to Stalin. So you have a situation where if you are Anton Kochinyan or Yakov Zorobian, because you know Mikoyan and Mikoyan is Armenian, that helps Armenia a little bit, right? Now, so this is actually kind of interesting because Mikoyan likes to use Armenia as a showcase of the Soviet nationality policy, to really show what a success Armenia has become thanks to the Soviet nationality policy. But in order to do that, in some ways he's undermining the principle of equality among nations, because Armenia gets a little bit of an extra advantage because they know this guy in Moscow who can get things done for them. There was even an interesting moment. So there was a very famous Soviet Armenian leader, 𝐏𝐤𝐸 who was kind of the deputy head of the Council of Ministers of Armenia. And he wrote in his memoir that, for instance, Armenia needed some additional funds for this project, and Uzbekistan had like a surplus, and they were trying to convince Mikoyan to siphon some of that money off and give it to Armenia. And Mikoyan said, well, I can't do this officially. How would it look on paper if I did something like this? So a lot was done discreetly, behind the scenes. And that's another interesting fact. So a lot we have documented in archives or in memoirs, but there was also a lot that was kind of done, behind the scenes too. And Armenia had a certain advantage within the Soviet system. And they also, I think, were given a little bit of extra freedom that other republics didn't have. And to the point that Armenia became almost like a hotbed for reform and decentralization. So if you look at the film We in Our Mountains, this is the famous Henryk Malian's film from 1969. It's all about the issue of decentralization.
Right.
About how the authorities, coming in from, whether it's the police official coming in from Yerevan, or if it's, Moscow telling you what to do, they really don't understand how to manage the situation locally. You need to devolve. And this was also another big policy Mikoyan had. He felt that system is too centralized. We need to devolve more local powers to local actors. And in addition to that, you also had Lake Sevan. Mikoyan played a major role in the ARPA-Sevan Canal project. So the ARPA-Sevan Canal project came as a result of the fact that Sevan's waters had been harnessed for hydroelectric purposes during the Stalin era. And after Stalin's death, the Soviet Armenian leaders said, well, we need to fix this issue somehow. We need to do something. And the conclusion came that we need to do this ARPA-Sevan Canal.
So you're saying we have a lot of infrastructure projects that we owe to Mikoyan.
Yeah, and also Mikoyan would advise the Armenian leadership. He said, so you want to do this ARPA-Sevan Canal. When you propose the idea to Khrushchev, which they did, they went with Khrushchev on a boat in the middle of Sevan in May 1961. And Mikoyan said, if you want to sell this idea to Khrushchev, only give him the cost of the tunnel alone. Don't give him the cost of the associated infrastructure. And later on, let the state budget take care of that.
Right.
And so this is kind of how it more or less went. I mean, Mikoyan played a massive role in what is today Armenia, developing it. That's why it's actually so ironic that you had the whole statue controversy, or people who say things like, what did Mikoyan do for Armenia? I mean, when it's clear that he actually, modern Armenia would not be what it is today without Anastas Mikoyan.
Right, so he advocated quite extensively for Armenia.
Yeah, exactly. It was a huge thing. And by the way, what I wanted to say also about Uzbekistan, just to clarify, I wanted to make a point, that was a cement resources, allocation of cement resources that were supposed to go to Uzbekistan, but Uzbekistan didn't need it, and Armenia wanted that extra allocation.
We talked a little bit about Armenia. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you, what was Mikoyan's position towards the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh?
Well, I'll tell you. So he was not involved in the decision to make Karabakh part of Soviet Azerbaijan. That is maybe a conversation for another day, but really the parties that are responsible for that, the men who were responsible for putting Karabakh within Azerbaijan were Narimanov, number one, and number two, Stalin supporting Narimanov. But that was actually also conditioned by the status of Karabakh on the ground, the fact that it was a Armenian self-governing region that was surrounded by Azerbaijani territory, and the British were trying to assign it to Azerbaijan, as we know, in 1919. But anyway, so that's kind of the context. But Mikoyan was not involved in that decision.
Okay.
Right? We have no documentary proof that he was ever involved in that kind of decision. But what you had was a period where the Soviet Azerbaijan had kind of an interesting party dynamic in the sense that you had some party leaders who were more internationalist. They were kind of in the vein of the Baku Commune, and they viewed Azerbaijan as more of a multi-ethnic republic. You actually even had a point in the 20s where there was Mirzoyan, who was an Armenian, and he was first secretary of Soviet Azerbaijan. Or you also had Sergei Kirov, who was Russian. So you had different kind of ethnicities in this faction of the party leadership of Azerbaijan that was multi-ethnic. But then you also had a Turkic faction, which viewed Soviet Azerbaijan as like a Turkic nation state, right?
Right.
This was the more chauvinistic faction of the Azerbaijani party leadership. And this faction really kind of became more or less dominant beginning in the 1930s when Bagirov, who was a protege of Beria, became the leader and first secretary of Soviet Azerbaijan, and he did repressions in Karabakh during the period of the terror. Sodem Badamyan, who was the chairman of the executive committee of Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, was arrested during this period for national treason, according to Bagirov's claims. You have beginnings of repressions. Then you also have a whole period where Karabakh Armenians feel like they're disenfranchised. So formally they're autonomous within Soviet Azerbaijan, but consistently there is a policy of discrimination by official Baku toward the Armenians throughout this whole period. And the Armenians constantly begin to demand, both from the bottom up, so Karabakh Armenians themselves begin to demand unification with Soviet Armenia, and also from the top down for secretaries. So Mikoyan, actually it's interesting that he didn't really have a position necessarily on this issue, but as the more Turkic element of the Azeri leadership became more prominent, and the reports came in about discrimination toward the Armenians of Karabakh, he became more sympathetic to the idea of transferring Karabakh to Armenia. So for instance, he would support Albertinov's initiative in the late 40s to transfer Karabakh to Armenia. He supported in 1960s Anton Kochinyan's initiative to resolve this issue. But these issues, especially in the post-Stalin era, would always arrive at a dead end because unlike Crimea, which was transferred from Russia to Ukraine, you had the issue where Azerbaijan would never consent to Karabakh becoming part of Armenia, and they would always use their veto to effectively prevent this from happening.
So nothing has changed there.
Yeah, well, nothing has changed because according to the Soviet constitution, no territory of a republic can be changed without its consent. And so they constantly were vetoing this throughout the Soviet period. And actually, there was very interesting conversations. So I mentioned Asatryan, who was speaking to Mikoyan, and he was in his memoirs. He recounts an episode where he went in Pitsunda to meet with Mikoyan on vacation, and he was talking about the conditions in Karabakh, because Asatryan was from Shatar village in Karabakh. So he was explaining to Mikoyan what was going on, and the subject eventually came up about why not transfer Karabakh to Armenia, and then he even brought up the point about why not transfer it even to the jurisdiction of Soviet Russia, because the situation in Karabakh is so bad, we'd rather have Soviet Russia take it over than Baku. And Mikoyan said, well, we can't do that because you need the consent of Baku, and Baku is not willing to consent that. Now, this is also kind of coming in the period of the increased zakonist legality, socialist legality, dismantling of Stalin's personality cult. So it's no longer a decision can be made on the whim of one man. You have legal institutions now that are strengthening, and so this is what you have. But what's most interesting is to wonder what changed when you have the period of Gorbachev. Why all of a sudden, instead of just a simple veto, was the response to the Karabakh Armenian demands the Sumgait pogrom in 1988? That's an interesting question worth exploring, but probably not today. In general, his policy was to support as much as he could, but also he came to a realization that it's not going to work as long as Azerbaijan keeps on vetoing it. But he couldn't just lift it from Azerbaijan and give it to Armenia, and certainly even Khrushchev could not do this. And that's important to understand the limits, in some ways, of Soviet central power, and also the limits of even a high Soviet official like Mikoyan, which a lot of narratives, a lot of Armenians, wonder, well, if it was, they almost overemphasize the centralized nature of the Soviet system. In reality, it wasn't. It was much more complicated.
All right, this is very interesting. Pietro, finally, what is Mikoyan's legacy in retrospect?
As my job as a historian is to look at people as they are, Right? So I'm not here to judge Mikoyan, but I will say this. One of his major legacies that we should really, I'd say even celebrate, would be the de-Stalinization. And specifically the movement from amnesty for just prisoners to amnesty for political prisoners, making the distinction between who is a prisoner and who is a political prisoner. So Beria does a general amnesty in 1953, but he doesn't just make that distinction. But Mikoyan does. And it's very important because through his position and through his speech in Yerevan, Armenia itself, not just Mikoyan, but Armenia itself plays a major role in this process of de-Stalinization. And that's something Armenians should celebrate. So Mikoyan is not a symbol of Stalinism. You had some articles during the 2014 statute controversy where some people were saying, looking at his role in the terror alone, that he was, a symbol of Stalinism. And I thought that's ridiculous because de-Stalinization is one of his major achievements. Also, de-Stalinization is intimately associated in Russia and the post-Soviet space, including Armenia, with democratization. Always.
Right. That's correct.
So whether you're dealing with the period of Khrushchev or Gorbachev, de-Stalinization goes hand in hand with democratization. So in that way, we can say Mikoyan in many ways was the person who really got the ball rolling on democratization. And we should be celebrating that.
And the same with the Soviet nationality policy, which was essentially his landmark initiative.
Well, landmark initiative, I would say specifically in the period of the post-Stalin era, because, before that you have Lenin and Stalin playing a major role in the nationality policy, but beginning in the 50s, Mikoyan really plays a major role. He talks about national nihilism and national chauvinism and the need to oppose both of those. And this is something he carries with him not only in that Yerevan speech, but also in the 1961 Soviet Party program. He was instrumental in removing from the party narrative the idea of the merger of nations. He felt that we should just let these individual nations express themselves. We should not merge or assimilate any nation. And also in the early 60s, Khrushchev had a broad vision for reforming and really democratizing the Soviet constitution. And Mikoyan was tasked with leading the committee on the nationality question. And it's remarkable the discussions they have. And one of his major objectives was to decentralize the Soviet system for the republics, to give the republics more power.
Right.
Some people were saying, and there he was talking with lawyers, and they said, well, why don't we just call the USSR a federation? Mikoyan was almost of the mindset that it should be something even more, like a union of states, like almost a confederation, which is incredible to think. So he really was advocating in many ways for, I would say, Armenian national interests and really interests of all non-Russian nationalities in the context of the Soviet Union. He really was doing a lot of work that a lot of people don't see, and more people need to look at that history. And hopefully my research can shed more light on that. I think that would be something I think that we need to change these discussions about the Soviet past in general, especially in the Armenian context, because there's so much we don't know and so much we should know.
Fascinating. Well, thank you, Pietro. This has been a great conversation about Mikoyan. We wish you great luck with your research.
Thank you very much, Osbet, and I appreciate being on this podcast, and I look forward to talking with you more. There's much more we can talk about, but yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That concludes this week's conversation on Groong. We look forward to your feedback, including your suggestions for conversation topics in the future. Contact us on our website at groong.org. That's Groong, or on our Facebook page, ANN-Groong, or in our Facebook group, Groong-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Lara Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. I'm 𝐏𝐢𝐞𝐿 Manoucharian, and on behalf of everyone in this episode, I wish you a good week. Thank you for listening, and talk to you soon.